Today's master class is going to look at the topic of whether you are ready or whether you are reactionary. And it was spurred by a survey that was done by PR News and CS&A consulting firm. CS&A is a firm that does crisis management, and they do crisis management plans, they do crisis communications plans, they do business continuity. The big difference between what I do and what they do is I specialize only in the crisis communications portion. They do the other portions, the plans that you should have, like the management plan and the business continuity plan. And when they went out with this survey, they asked questions that I've always wanted to ask people. I've always had hunches about it, but they were asking who has a crisis communications plan. Is your plan up to date? And other things that we're going to dig into today. Caroline Sapriel, who is the managing partner at CS&A, will join us from Belgium by video that is previously recorded. Because of the time difference between Belgium and where we are this afternoon in the United States, I recorded it. I actually recorded it in January because I wanted to use her interview as part of a January inspiration, renewal, set goals type program. And then other stuff started happening. We had the power outages in Texas. We had people with issues on social media. So there were more pressing topics that came up. However, now we're in spring, and I tend to think of spring as a time for renewal. And I went, this is the time for us to use Caroline's interview. So we'll be sharing that with you today, along with the items in the survey. I am going to share my screen with you so that you can follow along. After the program, we will share a link so that you can watch the entire program again, and there will be some downloads and other offers made to you as we go through this process. So are you ready, or do you operate by the seat of your pants, reacting rather than following a plan? My hope is always that you have a plan, but what we're finding out is so many organizations really don't. So it's spring, let's do some renewal, let's do some resetting of the goals. I know many people set goals in January, and then you break them by January 15th. So April 15th is a good time to reset those goals. And as we look at everything today, I always want you to think of the lens of the 5 steps to effective crisis communications. Do you have a regular vulnerability assessment program? I'm recommending once a month. Do you have a crisis communications plan? Is it a living plan? Is it up to date? Does it tell you precisely what you should be doing? Third, the lens of having pre-written statements. Stop wasting time in the middle of the crisis creating the statement that you can write on a clear, sunny day. Number 4, do you have well-trained spokespeople? Whether it's talking to the media, talking to customers, talking to members, talking to board members, talking to employees, the skills work with everything. And the 5th element is crisis communications drills. Do you drill at least once a year? Caroline will be our guest in a minute. As I mentioned, she's the managing partner of CS&A International. I've known her for about 20 of the 30 years that she's had her business. She and I often speak at the same conference, and we will see one another there. And I've always admired her work. She does a broader scope, whereas I go in specializing just on the communications aspect of things. So she does crisis management, business continuity, crisis communications. And in case you want to follow up with her and have a conversation with her, since she isn't with us live to answer questions today, there is a link on the slide on your screen to her profile on LinkedIn. So just connect with her on LinkedIn. She's a great resource to know. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jarrett Bro. I've been practicing crisis communications on my own since 1994. Prior to that, from 79 to 94, I was a working journalist, mostly in television. And then last year, I launched the app that is sponsoring this event, which is SituationHub. And SituationHub, if you're not familiar with it, is a crisis communication software platform so that when you have a crisis, you log in, you answer a few questions about the crisis, And it does a couple of things immediately. It notifies your crisis management team in an instant. It informs everybody about the details of the situation at hand. And within 3 to 5 minutes, it will write for you a pre-written news release, a statement that's ready to go out to all of your stakeholders, such as the media, your employees, your customers, or your community. Now, the objective here is in the master classes, we all get together once a month to look at best practices, to share ideas and best practices. We try to go to a higher level of thinking so that you are getting content that provides you with a little extra nugget of wisdom, that pearl of wisdom that lets you do the next thing that you need to do in order to be prepared. And really what we're trying to do at Situation Hub is to create a community of learning. It doesn't matter whether you're a subscriber to Situation Hub or not. In fact, I looked at the list of people in here. Today is one of those days where we have more people who are new to us, who are not necessarily subscribers, but it doesn't matter. You're all welcome here because this is a learning community. As we look at all of the concepts, I always want to remind you of my umbrella concept, which is in crisis communications, you think of it like an umbrella. You do not buy an umbrella because you hope it rains today. You buy an umbrella in case your sunny day becomes stormy. And that's the whole concept of crisis communications planning is if your sunny day becomes your stormy day, are you prepared with the tools that you need? And as we speak in terms of crisis communications and crisis preparedness, my definition is always this. It's any situation that has the ability to negatively affect the revenue, reputation, and brand of your organization. I was speaking to someone recently and she says, well, I really think of it more as issues management. Well, yeah, issues management, crisis communications, they all fall into that same bundle. Just because a situation begins to evolve does not mean that it is a crisis. But if you treat it with the attention that a crisis deserves, then you are prepared. You don't always have to release a statement, but you go through the steps to gather information, confirm information, get the crisis management team together, and prepare a statement in the event that you actually have to use it. So let's look at this whole concept of ready and reactionary. Do you have a plan in place or do you fly by the seat of your pants? And when PR News and CS&A went out to ask the question, they asked the question, does your company have a crisis management plan? And the word crisis management plan or the term crisis management plan can sometimes be a vague term because we don't really know, is it an incident command plan? Is it an emergency operations plan? Is it a risk management, business continuity plan, or crisis communications plan? So while it wasn't clearly defined here for us in the survey, what we did see is 62% of the organizations surveyed think they have something. That means 40% of the organizations in the world are flying by the seat of their pants. I hope you are not one of them. If you do work at one of those organizations that's flying by the seat of your pants, before the day is over, I want to talk to you and get you on the path to being prepared. Now, in a minute, we're going to talk to Caroline Sapriel from Belgium. And this is one of the slides that we're going to dig into. Of the people who have plans, 49%, let's say half, 50%, said their plan is up to date. That means that of the 60% of the people who say they have a plan, 30% have it updated, 30% don't. So essentially, 70% of the organizations surveyed don't have an up-to-date plan or a plan at all. That should scare the pants off of all of us. It is so much easier to know all the tools that you need and to have them in your toolbox when it's time to execute them rather than winging it, because when you wing it, you crash and burn. They also asked, what's the most difficult aspect of crisis response for the organization? And I circled the three that stuck out to me. Organizations have trouble reacting quickly. 41% say they have trouble reacting quickly. Last month, we had an amazing masterclass about social media and crisis communications. If you have not watched that program, I encourage you to go back to watch it, because in an age of social media, you do not have time to be slow in your reaction. Social media happens instantly, and you need to be on the ball, ready to communicate in seconds. Many organizations, 30%, say they have trouble preparing messages. Well, that's the whole idea of having pre-written messages and the 5 steps to effective crisis communications, or using SituationHub, because all of your messages are written and they're ready to go. It's a matter of fill in the blank, multiple choice, and you have a message that's ready to go in minutes. So it solves both of those first 2 items that I've circled. 40% of the organizations say they have difficulty communicating internally, which again is another function of your crisis communications plan. And then in the 5 steps to effective crisis communications, I always talk about drills as step 5. This was a rather scary but affirmed what I've seen over the years statistic. How often do you conduct an exercise or drill? 22% say once a year. 12% say they do it several times a year. So, gee, that's frightening. That's nearly 80% of organizations never do a drill. Some say they do it every 5 years. Let me emphasize the power of a drill. It allows you to mess up in private so you don't mess up in public. It's like an athletic team that practices before a game. If you're not practicing before the game, then you're not performing well in the game. So to perform your best, you should practice, and drills are an amazing way to practice. Another question that was asked is, do you have a system to learn from past crises? In some of the previous master classes, I've quoted Winston Churchill, who said, never waste a good crisis. Every crisis becomes an opportunity for you to study it, whether it's your crisis or someone else's crisis. 30% say they have a formal system in place. Again, that means 70% don't. So I think what we're seeing consistently is really only 30% of the organizations out there really dig in deep to do preparedness. This statistic and this question concern me greatly. Is your crisis management team familiar with the company's crisis management plan? Now, just by the fact that you're on the crisis management team would mean that we would hope you would take your job seriously. But only 25% of respondents say the members of their crisis management team really know that they have a plan and that they understand all the nuances of the plan. Again, a drill is an excellent time to provide the orientation that is necessary. So with all of those background questions, I decided to call Caroline Sapriel. We actually recorded this in January. I called Caroline Sapriel with CS&A International, and I wanted to go behind the numbers of what she saw. And when we went behind the numbers, I knew that the numbers were there, but I wanted to know, can we extrapolate anything further from those numbers? So with that, let me share my screen and make sure that we're able to share audio with you. So with that, let's go to our interview with Caroline. Out of all the responses you got, what really surprised you? What really stuck out as the most telling thing in the survey?
What really stuck out is the fact that about 65% of respondents said they had a plan, but only 40%, 40 or so percent said that it was updated. So to me, that was like, okay, so it's a false sense of safety. You tick the box, you have the plan, and then you never look at it again. The plan is the process of being prepared. The plan in itself is not the answer. But unless that plan is updated, I mean, nobody's ever going to use it. And if you do use it, 9 times out of 10, if it's not updated, you're going to have the wrong information. And so it's going to be counterproductive. And I can imagine a crisis team being together in a room, pulling out that plan, opening it up because it hasn't been updated, realizing that most of the information in there is out of date, and chucking it out across the table because, okay. And so they have to start from scratch. So what was the point? Plus, it's money wasted. So to me, in today's world, that is amazing because once you have a plan, updating is a dawdle. You just have to put somebody in charge. It really is not a big effort. It becomes a bigger effort when the company has acquired other companies, when they've reorganized, when they've divested. So there's a structural change in the organization that calls for a real review of the plan that is fundamental. But most companies have a plan. It works. It just needs update. And it should be, in our books, we recommend to clients that they should look at their plans once every quarter, once every 6 months. We also construct our plans, or we recommend that the best practice of plans contains 3 documents. The plan should have a policy. What is the crisis management policy? The second one is the guidelines, so all the roles and responsibilities, all the things that really doesn't change that much, but articulates the mandate, the role and responsibility of a crisis team, what they're supposed to do, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third part is a crisis workbook. And that's the part that needs update because that stuff gets out of date. So if you have it divided in 3 sections, it really is not a big job to update a plan.
And you and I have both looked at other people's plans over the years. And so often I will see an organization come in with a 3 to 6 page document that they found on the internet because they Googled crisis communications plans. And a lot of them come from schools and universities. So I imagine it was given out somewhere along the way at a conference or by a user group. So in that 60% who say that they have a plan, probably a lot of them are also really crappy plans that are 6 pages long and probably not worth the paper they're written on.
Right.
Have you come across that as well?
I have, and I think there's a misconception around the length of a plan. A lot of people say, "Oh, it should be short." If it's too big, then it's going to be impossible to use. Well, I think there's some value in that. I think the trick is to actually pull out certain components of the plan that can be laminated and used or used in a user-friendly format so that it is used. But in essence, the plan has to be comprehensive. Now, I agree with you that there's a lot of crappy plans out there. The main problem I see with plans that are not well written is that people try to make their plans according to scenarios. Right. And a crisis plan cannot be according to scenario because it's the modus operandi of the crisis team in any given crisis that you put at the back of the plan in the appendix or in the workbook a number of templates, a number of statements, a number of things that relate to the most likely scenarios you would encounter based on your scope of activities. Makes sense. But it should not be scenario based. What is scenario based is a business continuity plan. And a lot of people don't understand that. We're going to have a flood. We have a high risk of floods and cyclones. Let's make a plan for that. Why is that different in the way you mobilize, respond, and where your priorities are from a cybersecurity crisis? You need a cybersecurity plan. That's a business continuity plan that allows you to deal with disruptions and continue activities. But the crisis response to cybersecurity is rather generic, and people don't understand that. And so though the crappiest plans are the ones that try to see all possible scenarios and cover all bases. And that is impossible. It's as if you're standing in the forest and you don't see the trees.
Yeah, I agree. So let's surmise and look behind your numbers. And I know it's difficult to get this in a survey to ask somebody, why don't you have a crisis communications plan? But you and I have both been doing this for so long, we tend to see trends, why is it that you think so many organizations are so ill prepared and do not make preparedness a priority in their business models?
I think that there, first of all, needs to be a difference with what I call a crisis management plan and a crisis communication plan. And I believe that the survey probably surveyed mostly communicators or people with a communication function in organizations. The crisis communication plan falls under the crisis management plan. It is very rare that a communicator is in charge of the overall crisis management plan. There's no reason why they can't be, but very often it's not that way because they feel that they're really competent enough to only cover the communications part of the plan. The same as there should be an HR crisis plan, because if your staff is impacted by a crisis, you should have a plan. So why is it? I think it's because very often communicators either don't have the clout in their organization, their budgets get cut, and they feel we've ticked the box, we put the plan in, now we don't have the money to update it, or we don't know how to update it, or we are not connected to the people in the organization who actually are in charge of the crisis management process, which I call a crisis custodian. Communications is not always the crisis custodian. It's a part of the crisis organization. So I think those factors come in. And if, in large organizations, the communicator, the chief communicating officer, or the global communication director is going to be having a big responsibility for crisis preparedness. In smaller organization, it's okay, how do we deal with social media? How do we deal with the press? It's more tactical. It's not strategic enough. And so when it comes to updating, the update is very small. And if you're not given the budget or your budget is cut, not much you can do.
Now, you and I have both had relationships with lots of CEOs. And for me, it seems that some get it, some don't. Have you been able to discern at the higher level of the institution what makes the difference between a CEO who realizes that preparedness should be a priority as opposed to those who seem to be in denial about it?
I think CEOs who have lived through crises, real crises, not a bad week at the office, will get it because they have lived it. Their names are on the line. They probably had a lot of sleepless nights. A lot of it has to do with values of the organization. What is their value? Is it more important to make sure that we're prepared for crises, or is it more important to have a sponsorship? Now, the economic climate has an impact, but the organizations and the CEOs that have the right value with regards to crisis preparedness are the ones that are going to make it happen no matter what. And my experience is that when it is mandated from the top is when it makes a difference. It doesn't mean the CEO has to write it, but if the CEO says we have to have a plan, we have to practice our plans, we have to have a plan that is up to date, then usually it happens. When it is too delegated, it is not always working effectively. In fact, in our business, there is a saying that risk management is a pull-up phenomenon in the organization, and crisis management is a push-down phenomenon in the organization. So in other words, you really want to be aware of what risks, you need to have a culture that brings the risks up. But to be prepared, it's not a nice to have, it's a must have.
So we are doing this in January 2021, just to timestamp it for anybody who watches the replay on this. We are now 10 months into the globe's most ferocious crisis in almost 100 years. Two-part question. Number one, during this major crisis, have you, through your business and your colleagues, seen people investing more effort, time, money in preparedness? And coming out of this crisis, do you anticipate that more people will invest time, money, and effort in preparedness, or will they just keep going down the road and hope it never happens again? and go back to that denial syndrome that you and I have both seen before?
I think the answer to this question from what I've seen is that the ones who were committed to the topic before will be even more committed to the topics. The ones who really struggled and survived may be motivated to have something in place because they realize the importance of it. Mm-hmm. And the ones who sailed through and improvised and will say, well, you see, we managed, that's not important. So I think those who always were committed will be more committed. Some will become more committed. Others will just continue to operate the way they always did, which is, you see, I always told you we didn't need it. We managed, we were fine.
I see the very same thing. It's always amazing that no crisis has ever brought more people to the table for me to say, we want to be prepared for the next thing. I have observed very much the same thing as you, that people just think, we got through it, let's move on and go do the next thing.
I think I'm trying to remember, maybe 15 years ago or so, IABC asked me to write an article for Communication World at the time. Yeah. And the title of the article was, Why Are Companies Still Making the Same Mistakes?
Yeah.
And it's currently still valid.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
so some people learn from what they've experienced. Some people continue to sail through.
Old habits are hard to break. Do you have
because at the end of the day, it's people based. And I've been playing with this idea, which is, in very early stages, that I believe that AI to some degree would actually have an impact on this, because if decisions were made not just by emotions or personal judgment, but were made through rationalization of the facts that are in hand, you probably would have better decisions. So I'm not saying the entire crisis process should be decided by a robot, but I'm saying a little bit more AI into the mix would probably prevent some serious mistakes and may make it more organized, more efficient, more consistent. Mm-hmm. But then again, yeah, it's a little bit of a tricky subject because, but I think there is too much emotion and too much human error.
So give us some final thoughts on what you observed in your numbers and what you would suggest to people as we head into the year.
As we head into the year, we're not out of the wood right now. I feel that we're in this for another 6 to 12 months. I feel that clients are beginning to get used to this and are operating no matter what. Whereas with the first lockdown, there seemed to be a paralysis. The second lockdowns or the second waves and potentially third waves, people are used to that environment. So they're saying, to hell with this, we need to continue. Stock markets are not doing too badly. So out of the numbers, I feel that people now probably are going to pick up where they left off before COVID and maybe put some wind in the sails and re-energize the process. And again, I think those that were committed to the subject before will probably continue and become more committed.
Great. Thanks so much for your time today.
Your pleasure. It was nice talking to you.
All right. So with that, let's look at what you can do in the time that we have left. And what I'm going to challenge you to do is to go into a 30-day challenge. We're at the beginning of the second quarter of the year. It's springtime. It's a good time for you to renew your commitments and set some goals. Many of you are starting to see improvements and starting to see that there is getting to be some control over the virus. And that's kind of giving you permission to pick up where you left off, much like Caroline said. So here are some things that I'm going to personally challenge you to just pick one thing over the next 30 days and do just one thing to get better in crisis communications. And let's start with the burning question that was asked at the beginning of the PR News CS&A survey, which is, do you have a crisis communications plan, and is your plan up to date? So the action item in the 30-day challenge that I want to give to you is that if you do not have a plan, write or begin writing one within the next 30 days. And if you have a plan, take that plan out and update it within the next 30 days. Two critical pieces. Every crisis communications plan should be a living document. In the essence of a crisis communications plan, think of it as a tool that allows you to gather information about the event, confirm the information, and share it with your internal crisis management team. And then each of those team members go to their respective teams to make the crisis go away, and that your plan should outline how they make the crisis go away. But for the communications team, it outlines how then to specifically get information to your stakeholder audiences, which might be, and I'm going to say this is your most important one, your employees, your community, the media, customers, and whoever you have that might be unique to your business. So your two goals within 30 days, tackle that challenge. In the process of doing that, I would invite all of you to review who sits on your crisis management team, and to the survey question, evaluate whether you have the right people in the right seats on the bus. Now, that's a phrase from the book Good to Great that came out somewhere around 2003, 2004, and Good to Great still stands up today. And one of the great takeaways I took from that book was the concept of, do you have the right people on your bus, and are they in the right seats? So reevaluate your crisis management team. And a crisis management team doesn't have to be huge. If you're building a crisis management team because you don't have one yet, or if you're evaluating your existing team, I want you to think of it as concentric circles. The fewer decision makers you have in the room, the faster you'll be able to move. If you put 10 people in a room, you will get 10 opinions. If you put 4 people in a room, you're down to 4 opinions. Things move faster. So many organizations will have the CEO or a top executive as part of the crisis management team. And it really depends on how huge or how small of an organization you belong to, the type of company you have. Some companies are so big, it's something the CEO only wants to be informed about, and they rely on an incident commander to run the whole crisis management process. But in many organizations, they're small enough that a CEO wants to sit in on that. Someone from communications needs to be involved because they will run the crisis communications portion of the plan. Someone from operations needs to be involved because if it's an operational crisis, it affects everything in the organization. So we want their expertise. Many organizations have someone from HR, since it, in most cases, affects your people, your employees. And then each of the people in the crisis management team can have their own teams in the next circle. So not all members of the C-suite have to be in the crisis management team. Now, some companies are small enough that their entire C-suite is their crisis management team, and that's okay. You may not need your CFO in the room unless it's a financial crisis. So bring that person in if it's a financial issue. You may not need IT represented on the crisis management team unless it's an IT crisis. Then you bring them into the room. You do not need to have legal sitting in on the crisis management team. Legal is a consultancy that provides guidance. And one of the important things about having drills is it allows you to see what legal allows you to do and whether you have a legal person who's going to allow you to take the steps, or someone who is so afraid that you're going to screw up that they shut it all down and say no comment. When a lawyer says you should say no comment, you have a problem, and it means the lawyer doesn't trust you to do what needs to be done. The lawyer's job is to keep you from committing an act that will fuel plaintiff's attorney's case. You need to understand that. All members of the crisis management team need to understand that. And your crisis communications plan and your pre-written statements and your media training all should funnel into the concept of we all understand our legal liability and we will not commit any sort of a faux pas that will jeopardize the organization's revenue, reputation, and brand any further, especially in a court of law. As you go through the next 30 days looking at your crisis communications plan, I want you to think of it in terms of a crisis communications funnel and ask what is clogged and what works. Now, we've talked about the crisis communications funnel before. Some of you are here for the first time hearing about the crisis communications funnel, and it is on your screen, and the type is very small, and that is why I'm going to provide you with a PDF of this if you need to see it. After the class, there will be a replay. We'll send you to a link on the blog where you can download the crisis communications funnel. But let me explain it to you. In essence, the top tier is where the crisis happens. Do the people where the crisis happens have a mechanism to let someone know that they have a crisis? Or do they simply cover up and don't tell anyone because they're afraid to get fussed at? When that person, in whether it's customer service, operations, human resources, finance, whether it's a weather and natural disaster event, whether it involves the CEO and executive C-suites, whether it's an engineering issue, a social media issue, or an IT issue, if it happens in one of those departments, next level, who finds out? Who does that person tell? And then how do they transmit that information to the crisis management team? The third box here is really about how do you alert that team? Then how do you gather the crisis management team? Then how does the crisis communications team go into action? And how does the crisis communications team get information to the outside world? One of my friends who is on this call today had a challenge just the other day. It's a small electric company. And the electric company says, well, when we have an outage, our distribution guys find out, and our distribution guys are so busy trying to get the lights back on that they don't have time to both do their job and to tell us that they have a problem. Well, that's the immediate clog in your crisis communications funnel. If you've got a power outage in your electric company, somebody has to be able to tell the communications team that there's a power outage so that the outage just doesn't get fixed. You have to communicate with those members or customers of the electric company. So what we did was we analyzed where was the clog. So there's a power outage. The control room tells the distribution person that they need to dispatch linemen. That person then dispatches a crew to repair it, and then they answer the telephones from the 800 people calling in to say my lights are out. And because they're answering 800 phone calls, they do not have time to call the communications team. That's a problem. So we built a simple solution. We went into SituationHub, created 4 questions so that, number 1, they can call the people who need to repair the lines. Number 2, log into SituationHub, answer 4 questions, hit the alert button, and the communications team is immediately notified. The communications team then can send out a mass email or a blast notification through the app and tell everyone who's out of power why their lights are out, and then the 800 phone calls don't happen, and the dispatch and distribution people can do their job. So that's just a simple example of examining your funnel and determining where it's clogged. For most of you, it is clogged at the very top level. So as you build your crisis communications plan, let's unclog that. If you need help, call me and I'll walk you through it. As you either write your plan or review your plan, one of the things I want you to examine is whether or not you actually have a plan that tells you what to do, when to do it, who does it, that has details, or did someone write a pretty book about policy? Now, policy is important, but the policy needs to be baked into the plan. It doesn't need to live separately. So on this slide in red, it says, do the words on the page benefit you on the day of your crisis? Do the words that are written on the piece of paper that you call your plan actually benefit you on the day of the crisis? If it doesn't serve a purpose on the day of the crisis, then it doesn't need to be there. Public relations classes often teach people to establish policy. But what I've always tried to do is help you build a plan that is specific. I always say the more specific, the more terrific. I like to cook. I like to follow a lot of my mom's recipes, and she's passed now, and that's problematic when I pull out a recipe and it says add garlic to taste. Okay, that's useful, but boy, it sure would be nice if I knew, am I putting in 1 clove? Am I putting in 1 toe? How much salt? You know, I like to know the specifics. One of her recipes is for lemon icebox pie. It says use the juice of 2 large lemons. And my wife makes the pie for me all the time. And I said, you know, this last pie didn't have enough juice. She says, I used 2 lemons. And I went, we've never actually measured that it's a half a cup of lemon juice or a quarter cup of lemon juice. So the recipes aren't specific, so they're less terrific. So as you write your crisis communications plan or review your crisis communications plan, I want you to detail the steps of the crisis communications funnel, make it all specific. Your plan should never be a checklist. So if your plan, for example, says someone should write a news release, that is neither specific nor terrific. Who's the someone? Who does it? How do we contact that person? I need their contact information. What are the steps that they follow to write the release? Is there a pre-written release? Do we direct them to addendum 3 in the plan to find the 75 to 100 pre-written news releases that have been built and stored there? We want to know who does the job, when they do it, exactly how they do it, and we want to set a time limit on how fast they should do it. Every plan I've written since 1996 says within 1 hour or less of the onset of the crisis going public, a statement should be released to the stakeholders. That is 59 minutes behind Twitter. That is too long. That is too long. It is plausible in corporate world that an hour is a reasonable amount of time. But one of the things we did with SituationHub was try to tackle what we couldn't do in the plan, which was, can we make crisis communications happen at the speed of social media? So now within 3 to 10 minutes, you can execute everything. And I've actually been able to take the first 4 chapters of my crisis communications plan and condense it to 4 sentences of instructions in SituationHub. But whether you're using an automated system like SituationHub or using a plan, you have to have the mechanism in place to specifically tell people what to do and how to do it quickly. Vulnerability assessments should be part of your planning process over the next 30 days. Initially, I used to tell organizations once a quarter you should do a vulnerability assessment. I now say do it once a month. And I started doing that with the advent of COVID, because now each of your crises has a crisis within it, because COVID is often an element of the crisis that changes the nature of how it will unfold and how you will manage it. But if you've never done a vulnerability assessment, it's really about listing out all the things that could damage your revenue, reputation, and brand. What are the ordinary and predictable things? Weather and natural disasters, those are completely ordinary and they're predictable. You can't predict when the earthquake's going to happen, but if you live on an earthquake fault, it's predictable that you're probably going to have an earthquake at some time. What are the extraordinary things? So the extraordinary things and the unspoken things sometimes go together. Those are the horrible workplace shootings. Those are the crises that, take on a life for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days. A mine collapse or a disaster like that often falls into that category, or the aftermath of a natural disaster runs into that. What is the bizarre stuff? Bizarre is, often something goofy and foolish that an employee did that you just thought, who would ever do this? And you find out it's your employee, Bubba. He did it. What's new and challenging? Social media in itself is still relatively new and challenging as the cause of a crisis. So that's going to go in your vulnerability assessment. And then that gives you the pathway of your pre-written statements. So if you already have a plan, and if you have already done a vulnerability assessment, I'm going to challenge you over the next 30 days to look at your library of pre-written statements. The vulnerability assessment says these are all the things we want pre-written statements for. And as you're building a statement, I want you to look at the line down here where I'm putting my mouse. Your statement should contain facts. The statement should manage the expectations of your audience. In other words, how soon will this end, or how much worse could it get? And if there is death, destruction, injury, missing individuals, injured people, you need to convey empathy. It needs to be pre-approved for speed. And I know I've got a lot of my writer friends on this masterclass. The writer's ego needs to be put aside. And what I mean by that is quit trying to use flowery language. I had a speech impediment as a kid. I still have trouble saying, quit trying to enhance your language to make you look smarter than everybody else in the room. Think of it in terms of short staccato sentences that just state facts. Quit trying to write a publicity news release like you learned in college PR class. Quit trying to force a quote in from the CEO that you wrote for the CEO and that the CEO then wordsmiths, and you waste time doing this. Because when you look back at the news articles, virtually no news article ever uses the fake quote that you put in the news release. In 15 years as a journalist, I never used anyone's fake quote from a news release. So writers, put your ego aside and just nail out the facts in an inverted pyramid form in the way that a journalist wants to read it. And because one message should go to all audiences, it will satisfy the needs of your employees, the needs of your customers, the needs of your community, the needs of any of your stakeholder groups are all satisfied. On the screen here, if you're not familiar with how to work through the process of a vulnerability assessment and writing those pre-written statements, here's a peek inside SituationHub of all the vulnerabilities that a certain type of company would face. This one is for my friends at the rural electric cooperatives. And essentially what you do is you do the vulnerability assessment, and then each item on the vulnerability assessment should be prioritized as to what we need a pre-written statement for. And then you build a to-do list of how many statements. So, for example, in this subscription, looks like there are almost 80 different vulnerabilities that were identified. And of those 80 different vulnerabilities, we have 80 different news releases. Now, new vulnerabilities come up all the time, and therefore you add to your library of pre-written news releases as they happen. There's one that's passing right there on the screen that says generation and transmission interruption. That one was actually thrown in there during the ERCOT freeze when Texas was without power for 4 or 5 days Back in February, we just went in there, wrote it, added it, because it was a new vulnerability that needed a new pre-written news release. Another part of the 30-day challenge, if you've got your plan, you've done your vulnerability assessment, and you've also built out your library of pre-written statements, spend some time training your spokespeople. Media training prepares you not just for talking to the media, and the media that you talk to will come in various forms. They may email you, they may tweet to you, they may phone you, they may text you, they may show up in person, they might want you to have a news conference. Regardless of how they come to you, taking the pre-written statement and putting it on your website lets them go to your website and read the facts. The verbal portion of a media interview should happen after you have given them whatever the statement is that you're going to have, unless it's a news conference. If it is a news conference, read the statement first to the people in the room, then hand them the statement. If it's a one-on-one interview, it is perfectly fine for you to say, look, I have a statement here that I want to read. I know you're going to have questions for me, but let me read through the statement so I make sure I don't miss anything. And then after I read through all the facts and make sure we don't miss anything, then you can ask me follow-up questions. You can do that in person, one-on-one. You can do that on the phone. If it's a text, ask them to phone you, or if it's a text, then send them to your newsroom website. But make sure that there's never a misplaced word. And I'm really becoming a huge fan of using a script because it minimizes the number of ad libs, and a well-written statement should proactively answer all the questions that you will be asked. And if you proactively answer the questions, then you will be asked fewer questions as follow-up, thus eliminating your chance to ad lib, thus eliminating your chance to mess up. Here is a simple statement. Again, this one's written in SituationHub, but I want you to see the first paragraph is long because it is the preamble that adds context. But then you see numbered paragraphs. There are 20 numbered paragraphs. I love to number the paragraphs for the spokesperson so that you can keep track of where you're going. And it covers who, what, when, where, why, and how. The event happened at approximately 12:30. The action could best be described as rioting. This location where it's occurring is commonly known as our headquarters. The address is 123 Main Street. The group that is protesting is known as Citizens Against Us. According to the group, the organization is protesting because of issues related to XYZ. Simple, short sentences save time when you bring it in for approval. The more commas you add, the more rewrites you invite. Adults fight over commas. That is a horrible trait, but nonetheless, it is true. And then the final thing that I'm going to put in your 30-day challenge, you don't have to have a drill within 30 days, but I want you to set a time for getting to a drill. Let's make a commitment over the next 30 days that you will do a drill somewhere within this year. Now, when you do a drill, it can be a combination of tabletop or live action. When I write a drill, if you're writing your own drill, the goal is make it like a murder mystery with misdirection. Make it like a murder mystery with lots of misdirection. Have at least 2 news conferences during the drill. It lets you test your plan, it lets you test your team, and it lets you test your spokespeople. And a big part of it is if you mess up, you're messing up in private rather than messing up in public, which then allows you to make adjustments to your plan before you have to go out in public again. So it's just so fulfilling to actually be able to get you in a position where you can practice it and find out if everybody's on board. Self-examination goals. Here they are. Recap as we wrap up the program today. Review and identify who's on your crisis management team. Either review or perfect your crisis communications funnel. Either make a commitment to write the plan, or update your plan within the next 30 days. Make sure you do a monthly vulnerability assessment. Set time to train your spokespeople. Set time for a crisis communications drill. I don't expect you to do all, but I'd like you to pick one. If you need me to be your accountability buddy, as always, there is my link to Calendly. You click on that link, and it's in the emails that we sent you about the class. It'll be in the follow-up email with the replay, so that if you want 15 minutes just to have some accountability, I am happy to be your accountability buddy. I believe in the crisis communication sprint process, which is every one of these tasks can be done in a single day. So if the task is too big for you to handle in a day, by all means, call me and I can actually knock it out for you in a day, because I've done it so many times before. We've got a few minutes left that we can have chat. I had a couple of people asking, what if they need a deeper consultant conversation with me. So here on the screen, you have 2 links. If you need just a confidential chat to do some planning and accountability, use the link there. If you want a 1-hour planning session, I will do a $299 planning session. Just send an email to me at jared@brocommunications, and we'll schedule time for you to have a planning session. So my friends, as always, it is a pleasure to spend some time with you. We were a little later in the month this year because I needed to leave room for everybody to get home from spring break. If we'd had it last week or the week before, so many of you would have been out. Our next master class is targeted for May 6th, and we will send you information about that class. I appreciate your time here. My name is Jared Bro. If I can be of assistance to you to help you with your crisis communications, by all means, give me a call and use that link to schedule some private time to talk. We'll see you next month. Bye.